This episode is brought to you by Olson. Olson is a nationally recognized employee-owned engineering and design firm with a rich history of success. Founded in 1956 on the very mindset that drives them today, they're here to improve communities by making them more sustainable, better connected, and more efficient. Simply put, they work to leave the world better than they found it. They have more than 2,000 professionals and offer a comprehensive list of services including planning and design, engineering, field services, environmental, and technology. You're listening to the Booked on Planning podcast, a project of the Nebraska chapter of the American Planning Association. In each episode, we dive into how cities function by talking with authors on housing, transportation, and everything in between. Join us as we get booked on planning. Welcome back, bookworms, to another episode of Booked on Planning. In this episode, we talk with author and co-editor Zahra Ebrahim on her book, Messy Cities, Why We Can't Plan Everything, which was also co-edited by John Lorink, Leslie Wu, and Dylan Reed. I thought this was a really fun read. It's a series of essays, and it's broken into 6 different topic areas, but you really see the perspective of mess from another dimension. Oftentimes, we really want things clean and put together, but understanding others' experience, and we get into this a little bit in the episode of how others have to navigate cities in a different way that may appear messy to us, but is actually how they can experience the cities.
Yeah, I thought that each of the authors really brought to light a different aspect of mess. So we have conversations about mess around nature, mess around design, like roads that maybe you and I can navigate, but not everyone can navigate. Looking at different global cities like Mexico City or how we look at Tokyo was really interesting and different in how we reconsider different urban systems. We talk about desire lines in the episode, and we talk about how sometimes what appears to be a mess to some people is actually just another person utilizing the city in the best way they possibly could.
I personally identified with the ecological section and the essay that was around leaving leaves and not picking them up because it helps really enhance the biological function of our cities. So I read this in a time where I really wanted to clean up my yard and pick up the leaves and refrained.
Good for you. I have been leaving the leaves in my backyard for a while now, and I have more fireflies. So it really works if you can rein yourself in and not clean up. Let's get into our conversation with author Zahra Ebrahim on her book, Messy Cities, Why We Can't Plan Everything.
Zahra, thank you for joining us on Booked on Planning to talk about your book, Messy Cities, Why We Can't Plan Everything. This collection of 42 essays is broken into 6 categories. What were the ideas that you and your co-editors were trying to express in this book?
I think the idea for the book surfaced through an experience one of our editors had with someone visiting Toronto, and we write about that in the introduction. They were delighted by the messiness of Toronto. Some people say Toronto's New York, designed by the Swiss or something. And because for those of us in Toronto, we don't see it as messy. We almost see it as overly orderly. One of the editors, Dylan, was sort of the genesis of this idea came from him, sort of, ambiently hearing through one of his colleagues that James Roja, who wrote the first essay on Messy Cities, had noted this about the city. And as Dylan started to explore the idea, he had been writing about it in our local magazine, Spacing, which is about urbanism. He realized that the singular idea of messy urbanism doesn't exist. The reason we assembled this as an anthology, and 4 of us edited it and brought it together, was because as Dylan explored the idea further, he realized that messiness is such a pluralistic concept. It's a concept that, in human language, it's like, different for everyone. The way we perceive mess and by extension order in cities has a huge, it's sort of impacted, from our lived experience, from our culture, from what is sort of normal to us. And so, I think I couldn't even name all the ideas we were trying to communicate. I think that central piece, which is this is an idea that can't be contained, and the way that we look at cities needs to have a more diverse lens on what order looks like for people. We really wanted to show, not tell, through the stories that in Toronto and cities all over the world, we interpret it very differently. And what we see is very different, which is how we got all the essays. We didn't actually give our contributors that much prompting. And this is what we got.
Yeah, I have to admit, I would have never thought of Toronto as a messy city. And I guess that's one of the points that you make in the introduction is that we need to rehabilitate what the word messy actually means, which you were starting to talk about. So, how do you feel that the book actually achieves that goal?
That's a great question. I think messy, especially these days, is weaponized. It's highly political that a politician can win on cleaning up a mess. The way in which we think about mess is along a continuum. It includes infrastructure, the state of infrastructure, access, economic opportunity, and then it also includes people. Sometimes politicians will name specific groups as creating a mess in cities and places. I think we wanted to talk about how that is false and that the idea of mess is being weaponized when truly what we're trying to pay closer attention to when we look at things that don't seem like they fit in the order of the city is sometimes people trying to work in workarounds and make the city work for them. We may perceive it as a mess, but it's also a way in which people are getting things they need that the city, and I use that term kind of loosely, is not providing. And there are clues to how we can help everyone thrive in cities just by virtue of that. And so I think we've rehabilitated the language of messy by inviting readers and all the people who are contending with this idea of messy urbanism to use it as a way through something complex that's happening in your city, that's happening in your community, as a new lens, a new way to see, a new tool for noticing where there might be an opportunity to support a community or to support an idea to actually not have to be a workaround, but be a real thing. The easiest example of that is what Dylan writes about in the introduction, which is desire lines. You know, there's a study happening on a park in Toronto right now about the way in which people move through that park. And some of the sort of architecture and urbanism critics are saying, well, we actually know the way people move through, especially in winter, because we see the desire lines. And Dylan writes about this extensively. So that's one example. We could put a path where the desire lines are. But there's so many examples in cities of how people do this to create access to economic opportunity, to create social connection, to create joy.
I think the book does, and all the essays within the book really do a great job of that, of giving you that perspective. One of the more basic examples in the ecological section was about how if we leave the leaves and don't clean them all up in the parks, that's actually helping ecological growth. And it's really hard for individuals that are used to just cleaning up these leaves and getting rid of them to let them just lay there. But understanding what the mess is doing and how it's benefiting is, I think all these different stories really do a good job of that.
I mean, the leaf litter is one of my favorite examples in the book. It's such a great way to illuminate. It's all in how we see things. We've gotten so practiced in seeing, the way in which a front yard is supposed to be, the way cleanliness is also kind of political too, and what's clean, what's dirty, and the idea that having these heaps and heaps of life and organic matter sitting on our front yards is a disgrace. Or something to be cleaned up is actually not aligned with where we want to go in terms of being more gentle and lighter on the planet. But it's all in sort of retraining, rewiring our defaults, if that makes sense.
A lot of these examples are demonstrations of good messiness in cities. What are some of your favorite examples from the book?
Oh, that's a great question. It's so hard to talk about which ones are my favorite because I love them all. My colleague Leslie Wu wrote a piece about steel pan drums and noise, and I think this is a point of contention for many communities, especially Toronto. Some say it's the most diverse city on the planet, but over 50% of our population identifies as being born outside of Canada. And so you're going to have different perceptions of what celebration and gathering looks like. And I loved her story about what was just a way of a family finding themselves in this new place was a disturbance, an offense to other people. So I really loved Leslie's story about noise. I think Chi Tam's called An Argument Worth Having, which talks about intergenerational tension around trying to evolve the city and what it takes to get things done. And in the piece, she talks about conversations she's having with business uncle, just, an older man in the community that she needs to sort of bring on side as they're thinking through opportunities for a land trust, which by extension might mean affordable housing, but they're finding themselves in tension and potentially at odds. And I love that a lot of the biggest expressions of change in our city start with these conversations that are not straightforward, that involve moving cross-culturally, intergenerationally, And I really think that she embodies in the story such a great example of how we all live out that mess because we're negotiating with our fellow city dwellers all day. And that is part of the choice to live in a city, is to learn how to negotiate, how to share. And so what I love about Cheese is that it's not about the stuff, right? It's about the systems. It's about how we connect. So those two are definite favorites. I will say These Walls, These Roads by Amir is also an example of the impact of the mess on us, how we create boundaries to places that feel like home, that are home, and how the mess of the politic and the expression of infrastructure actually creates barriers to finding home and comfort. Maybe I'll say one more. I love Ajib Bhatia's piece on tower communities are what we make them. I have known Ajib since he was a teenager. He's now a grown man who's a planner. And we met when I was working in Scarborough and he was quite young. And, he really found a way to talk about what it was like to grow up in a tower, which is we boast about being this multicultural society in Toronto and in Canada. And the reality is, in a lot of contexts, we are very segregated. We are very siloed, largely by class. But what's so beautiful about his story is how there are worlds in towers, like the expression of multiculturalism, the expression of knowing the sounds, the smells, the ways of being, the different worldviews. The promise of multiculturalism actually existed in these places that we have neglected for so long. I quite like Ajiv's. I think it's a great example. Metropolitan areas all over the world have these old towers that are dismissed and forgotten and neglected, house primarily newcomers and low-income populations, but they are also vital sources of mixing and the place in which sort of multiculturalism is actually existing in our cities.
One of the things that I noticed first as I was going through the index and reading the names of the essays explicitly pointed out in the book is that y'all chose to focus on cities that don't often get a lot of urban design notice, which I really appreciated. How did you end up coming to choose to focus the books primarily on cities in Canada, Mexico, Japan, etc., when so often we look to New York City or cities in Europe?
Yeah. I mean, there's two ways of answering this question. One is the truth, and one is the smoothing out, the remix, which is okay. So let me start with the truth. The truth is that the way this book came together is that there were voices, there were people who had stories we knew had stories that needed to be told. We weren't sure what those stories were, but we knew with the prompt they would be able to illuminate different dimensions of messy. There's four of us. We have shared values, very different lived experience. And so we went out to our communities finding those people whose stories really need to be told, who have a story in them. So that's one part of it. And sometimes it was also topics. So we were talking about things like graffiti. We were talking about things like noise. We were talking about the things that people would expect to hear about in a book about messy urbanism. As a team, we made, I don't know if it was an intentional choice, but we did recognize that, places like New York City, places like Copenhagen have long been sort of fetishized in the canon of urbanism as places to look to. And I think those stories are, and specifically when you think about Scandinavia as an example, they're well documented examples of what they call successful urbanism. I think many people might say that as the world changes and the geopolitical forces mean that migrations are happening in ways that haven't happened in many generations, these places are starting to contend with the challenges of diversity, multiculturalism. They're also becoming a little messy. And the systems of modernism that require high degrees of control don't work as well because people are going to find home where they are. So I think we wanted to shine a light on places that, to your point, Jennifer, don't get a lot of daylight. But I think as importantly, because we weren't as conscious of the jurisdiction people were going to write about, we were just resolved that places like New York, major cities in Scandinavia and Europe already have an established place in the canon of urbanism. And it's time to expand our aperture. You don't see great cities like, where we go to South Africa, we go to Mexico City. And yes, Cape Town and Mexico City, these are places that we talk about, but there's so much to learn from these places. And I think a lot of people perceive those places as chaotic. If you come from a Eurocentric planning paradigm, the traffic flows are chaotic, the movement of goods and services is more informal in some places. And I think there's just so much to learn from that. What we see in a lot of these circumstances of messiness is people creating opportunity for themselves and for other people. I would love to say that we chose these places in the world, but our contributors did, and they did an amazing job.
One of my favorite stories was based in Mexico City and
Mm,
talking about the different architecture and how architects
yeah.
think about buildings in Mexico City different, and how here in the United States we get glass and steel buildings, but then in Mexico they get these beautiful colors and different textures designed to actually meet the needs of the people who live there.
Yeah, it is the expression of identity that happens in cities like Mexico City, like Cape Town. It's quite remarkable. We don't see that as much. We see that in the alleyways and in the nooks and crannies in our cities, but in Mexico City it's on display, and it's such a yeah, it's such a great story.
And I also think it's interesting too, and I think it was in the essay about Tokyo where she describes how, as tourists, we go to these places that have all of this messiness and what seems like chaos, and we really enjoy it while we're visitors. But then when we
Yes.
come back to our home cities, we want the sterile and clean lines, and we kind of forget how wonderful it actually is to be in a place like that.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's what has become comfortable to us versus what we want. I think that's something we talked about a lot when we were tossing ideas around for this book. Everyone travels. They travel to the global south, they travel all over Asia. They talk about the vibrancy and the culture and how it's so expressed and visible. And then they come back and just defend order. And I do wonder is that we know how to visit, but do we know how to live in different types of order? And I think that just takes practice. And I think it would enable us to have those moments of vibrancy and joy in our everyday, which is part of why we live in cities. We want to be delighted and surprised in good ways. And I think in the same way as when we travel.
So, messiness, as demonstrated in a few of these essays, can be good and bad.
Yeah.
There's some examples, like with the shared streets impact, that we like taking away all of the structure and creating these shared spaces. But if we're not very intentional about it, it can impact someone who's visually impaired. Can you talk about how to avoid creating some of these harms while trying to also create thriving communities?
I mean, I think the grounding in all of this, messiness is not full urban disorder. Right? We're not trying to like fetishize chaos in this book. And we've been really careful to avoid that. I think part of what we're trying to do is when we see things that are anomalous in our urban environment, it's telling us that someone has tried to change something to make it work for them, that something is not right. Just today, we had a fresh snowfall, and today is garbage day. There's about a foot of clearance on the sidewalk with all the garbage cans and the snowbanks, and it's a mess. Like our city right now, we have so much snow. Like we had this historic snowfall a few weeks ago, and it's the snow is everywhere, and it's calcified. Our city's quite messy right now, and that is not the kind of mess we are advocating for. A mess that stands in the way of access, a mess that stands in the way of people living their lives, a mess that stands in the way of safety. And so I think the mess is much more discreet, and mess should not interrupt people's life, but should sort of make it easier and better. So where mess is interrupting people's life and standing in the way of them being able to do the things they need to do, that's not the kind of mess we want to see. And so I think there's a discreteness to the kind of messes we've found, because often a lot of them are not visible either. Right? Like if I think about Sneha Mandan's piece on banquet halls, and it's like these are, large, some people might say unattractive side of highway buildings, but for a lot of communities, specifically South Asian communities in Toronto, they might even designate them heritage because they hold so much history. And so, yeah, I don't think that where mess stands in the way of access is not a mess that we endorse.
So, as we were talking about earlier, nature is mentioned throughout a few of the essays. And one of the prompts that I really loved was to ask ourselves if a forest is a mess or is a meadow a mess.
Yeah.
I've never thought of either of those places as a mess. So, I started to think about why do you think we've come to view nature in a city as something that we need to have absolute control over and make sure that it's pristine and that your grass is a certain level and that your flower beds are all edged? How can we shift that mentality?
I keep saying another favorite piece because I love them all dearly, all of them. And so it makes me think of Suzanne Kite and Robbie Wing's piece in the book, which is about humans and non-humans and about trying to take a group of people through an experience in a city that helps them recognize that the more than human world has rights too, and has behaviors and has societies and communities. We need to recognize their rights. In some cases all over the world, in Quebec, we have an example of where a river has been given personhood. There's so much work happening in your country about this at places like NYU with their More Than Human Rights Institute. As Suzanne and Robbie talk about, we see nature as something to be dominated and controlled. We don't see it as kin. In Canada, many of the Indigenous communities across Canada, all of the Indigenous communities across Canada would see nature as kin and would treat it with the reverence that you would treat kin with. The way in which we go about dominating and imposing our agenda on nature is not aligned with worldviews of Indigenous communities in Canada. And so I think that they bring up a really good point, which is what would happen if we saw that the grass and the goldenrod had rights, had a right to thrive, and that thriving meant not being pulled out as soon as they break through the surface of the earth. Not being perceived as a weed, but recognizing that they are native to this land. To me, that's the most compelling case, which is in a time of compounding ecological crises, having this lens which has us approach nature entirely differently, which is understanding like what does it take for our more than human kin to thrive? Like, what do they need, not just versus what we need? Because all of the controlling of nature is in service of our aesthetic desires. And in some cases, our public health desires, like trees should be here because this is where we recreate. Or like, in a lot of communities in Toronto that don't have a lot of shade cover, you see high incidences of melanomas, we put trees, but always the more than human world is in service of us. How can we think through a lens of reciprocity and consider what would doing right by nature actually mean? What are the conditions under which native species in our city are not perceived as invasive, but actually right at home? That's why they find their way through cracks in the cement. It's because that's their house. They do a really good job of telling that story, because if we recognize nature as having rights, then we are inflicting a lot of harm onto the natural world, as we know. But it's another lens to see that and reinforce that story.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example that goes back to the tagline of your book of why we can't plan everything, because I think almost every zoning ordinance or municipal code probably has a section in it about noxious weeds or tall grass ordinances. You run afoul of your local ordinances and end up having to cut it down. And so as planners, I think it's changing in several communities, but I know here in Lincoln, we have someone that has a completely native property, but then often the native plants get too tall, and so they have to cut them in the boulevard.
Too tall, and yet maybe it's like pure state of thriving.
Yeah.
It's who's
Yeah.
who's you've just summarized the whole ethos of the book. Whose eyes are looking, whose eyes are seeing. Messy Cities takes you on a tour of different people noticing mess and saying, I love this. In the ecology section of the book is where, we're sort of like turning the camera or we're changing who the seer is in some ways to say, oh, wow, they're tall, they're doing great.
So you describe in one of your essays about your neighborhood and the street you live on, Edwin Avenue, which sounds far more lovely and amazing than the boring street that I live on. Can you describe in your own words for listeners what your street's like and why it's such an engaging space?
Yeah. Now, everyone I talk to, I'll say, oh, I'm headed home. And they're like, oh, yeah, you live by Dundas West. Everyone knows where I live now because Edwin Avenue is in the book. They're like, we know you live on Edwin Avenue. Many people would argue that Edwin is not the most beautiful street in the city. That is not what makes the street such a rich place. I describe this a little bit in the book. I have many hypotheses. There's the science of it and the alchemy of it, and I don't know what the balance is. But my hypothesis, my running hypothesis, is that to my earlier point, we don't class mix as much in Toronto. We're quite segregated by class in our city. Edwin Avenue is interesting because we exist within 3 railroad tracks, east, west, and north, and the east and west ones come to a point, so we exist in the Junction Triangle, and we have a very strong identity of being a factory community in the middle of like some of the most affluent and desirable neighborhoods in the city. We're very close to an area called Hyde Park, which is just a beautiful established part of the city, and Bloor West, which is an active and vibrant sort of economic hub and really established residential community as well. And we sort of sit in the middle. And because we were home to so many factories for so long, and as a result of the factories being in our neighborhood, I think 2 rubber factories and a paint factory, our neighborhood was always perceived as toxic. The workers lived in the neighborhood. The homes that we all live in are quite small, as I describe in the book. They're just like, they're the right size. They're not small, but they are the right size. They're as much as we need in an overhoused, in the case of a society that tends to, in some cases, be quite overhoused. we are right-sized, and even I might even argue that we have more space than we need still. And so I think the intimacy of the planning and the design, and because there's just not a lot of extra space, you're interacting all the time. You're seeing each other all the time. And so there aren't expansive parts of where I live, whether I'm in the front or the back of my house, where if I'm outside, I'm not in a few meters of a neighbor. And so constantly negotiating. And I think because of the design of the homes, which are smaller, and many typical nuclear families want more space, these houses are not as desirable for them. I think because of that reason, people age in place more, people live intergenerationally more. There's a bunch of renters in our neighborhood, there's public housing in our neighborhood, there's co ops in our neighborhood. It's a very small slice, about 6,000 households, not that big in the context of the large city. We're constantly mixing and passing by each other and constantly sharing things. And you learn that really quickly when you move to Edwin Avenue, is that you need to check if anyone else has something before you buy it. And so just now I ran into a neighbor who was saying how quiet it's been on the other side of the wall since my partner's been out of town. And we got to chatting, and I was telling her how I was dreading going to the grocery store because we just had a snowfall. And she's like, well, list off the ingredients you need and I'll tell you if I have them. You can just grab them from my house for this dinner party you're having tomorrow night. And that was just another example. I was outside for a minute doing a quick shovel, and the neighbor's like, I got everything you need for the dinner party. Just go get it from my house. Because of those interactions, you feel supported. I was going to go to the grocery store, but you just constantly are feeling supported. And I write about this a little bit in the chapter, which is like, this is the infrastructure we miss. This is what makes not the most beautiful neighborhood in the city, but this is what makes it so beautiful, is that our social infrastructure is strong. It's exceptionally strong. And it's continually nurtured because you can't avoid each other. There are very few places to avoid each other. And so you're constantly taking care of each other. You're constantly checking in. You're constantly sharing life together. And that's what makes it so great. The social infrastructure is our hardiest infrastructure. And that's why the neighborhood's so amazing.
So, alongside reading Messy Cities, I've been reading the book The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker.
Yeah, it's great.
And she shared a story about a woman who had a neighborhood like yours and had to move into
Yeah.
a somewhat more sterile neighborhood, the way that Stephanie and I's neighborhoods probably would be more considered. We are stoic Midwesterners.
Yes.
But the woman sent her two little girls out on their bikes
Yeah.
and taped notes to everybody's door saying, like, I want to host something. Come if you want to come. Here's my number, text me, and then be prepared to answer 3 things you love about your life or something like that, and created that social infrastructure. And as I was reading that story, I thought about your neighborhood as well. And it's just like that connection. We don't have that connection anymore in so many cities. And I guess you could call it messy, but I call it connection.
Yeah, well, it involves a leap of faith, right? Like when we moved to the neighborhood 7 years ago, I'm by nature someone who's active in community. And I had heard that because of all the health challenges in the 70s and the 80s, it was like a very organized neighborhood, very active. And I didn't want to step on people's toes. And there's a community space, kitty corner to where I live, that was actually designated through a planning clause called Section 37. It's a community benefit. So there's a community center on our street. I'd run into a few people in the neighborhood and I said, can we just do a little gathering? I just want to know who's organizing. A bunch of people showed up and said, I'm doing this. And there were so many people who were active. And I was like, okay, we don't need another community group. But it would be really nice to just have a regular neighborhood gathering, and maybe we could just call it like the buddies. And the Junction Triangle buddies could just do fun things. It's not activism. It's about making sure we continue to see each other and talk to each other and take care of each other. So when I moved to the neighborhood, just very conscious about like not wanting to step on established organizers' toes. It did things like hosted a little Sunday gathering at the community center. We made a playlist in a mocktail called the Rusty Rail because we live by the local social enterprise within the community center. We came up with this idea. It was basically iced tea. The whole neighborhood made a playlist. We shared it and then everyone went home. It was nothing. And it was exactly that, right? It was so surprising when I felt like I really met the neighborhood, when I started to see like, oh, wow, there's like people who've lived here for 55 years and people who have lived here like me for 6 months. I think it takes initiative, of course, but I don't think it's unique to me. I don't think it's unique to that woman. I think it's in our nature to want to be surrounded, held, and supported. Neighbors are like not chosen family, but like, I don't know, distant cousins or something.
They're the first ones that noticed you didn't scoop your snow.
They're the first ones that notice that you haven't shoveled. They're the first ones who don't see your lights on and wonder what's up if they don't see you for a few days. So they're part of our lives, whether we acknowledge it or not. I just think we're losing that muscle because we become increasingly individualistic. I'm not going to go on about technology, but all to say that as we veer more individualistic, more isolated. We need to extend ourselves. Not talking to each other is a source of a lot of distrust and polarization and the kinds of things that actually make our lives exceptionally hard. I could talk about my neighborhood for another half hour, but I'll stop here.
Several contributors of the book write about the inner lives of unlovely buildings,
Yeah.
such as banquet halls and industrial areas. Why should we value these aesthetically boring or messy structures as much as we adore our landmark architecture?
Again, I don't think that it is for the communities that cherish these places. I don't think they're seeing these places as beautiful in the way that we see a traditional kind of historic or building as beautiful. But I think they're so loaded with memory that it's impossible to disentangle. It's kind of like how we love one of our cherished old sweaters or something. Like we love these things that aren't obviously beautiful to everyone, but hold so much memory for us. And I think it's not the first choice of many communities to use those spaces. I think they're in part using them by necessity, affordability and accessibility, large groups coming together, predominantly driving, and need an affordable place to gather. And so I just think that we have to take a beat and acknowledge that everything worth preserving is not going to obviously be as aesthetically aligned with what we've designated as heritage, as landmarks. Last week I was describing Toronto like an onion. I was like, we are the onion city. No one lands in Toronto and has their breath taken away. That's not who we are. I grew up in Vancouver. I know what those kinds of cities are. Toronto's not that kind of city. Toronto's the kind of city that when you peel back the layers of the onion, which are our neighborhoods and the culture of each of our neighborhoods, when you go through the door of a building that looks banal and find some cool arts collective doing incredible work, we are the kind of city where you have to peel the layers back in order to see our richness, our beauty. In the Toronto context, that feels very aligned because we're not a city that has landmarks people travel to come see, maybe except for the CN Tower. And so it feels like a disservice to the many communities who haven't been provided access to a lot of these incredible spaces. To discard those places is to dismiss their lived experience. And I think it would be so beautiful to enable access to places that dignify these experiences for everyone. We need to look at these buildings differently that seem unlovable or aesthetically different from our established perception. We have to be okay that the non-obvious still has richness to it. I think we want to consume things that affirm our defaults of what beauty is and richness is. And I just think in modern cosmopolitan cities, like those things are not going to be in plain sight. Sometimes those are the best places.
Yeah, I was just having this conversation with my students. I teach a historic preservation
Oh,
class in the spring,
cool.
and really trying to convey that the field of historic preservation is moving away from designating just the beautiful architectural pieces and trying to do the hard work, because it is often harder to find these culturally significant places, because if you just do a regular field survey, you're going to skip right over them because they are pretty, sometimes bland or not high architecture that you would traditionally have thought of as a space to designate, but they are so important in telling the story of a city and a community and how it's evolved over time.
Well, and that connects to the Plaza Pops essay, right? In Toronto, strip malls are part of our aesthetic. These plazas are very much a part of our urban landscape as soon as you're outside of the downtown core in the inner suburbs. You see a lot of this expression of this typology. And yeah, they're places that matter. People gather. People, they spend time in parking lots. Teenagers hang out in the parking lot. Lots of communities, the parking lot is a really cherished place. And so I think to dismiss them is to dismiss those stories. In Canada, the definition of heritage, it does not hold our heritage because it mostly recognizes colonial buildings and architecture, does not recognize any indigenous form in our city. Heritage is also very limiting. Culture is how we gather, how we eat, how we celebrate. Culture is so much more than just the artifacts that get produced out of our gathering. And so similarly, especially in Canada, we urgently need to redefine and expand the definition of heritage.
So you mentioned Plaza Pops. That's one essay that shows a dual approach to creating neighborhood spaces. The other one being a story out of COVID of creating a beach in a neighborhood
Yeah.
space. So one of them went out of their way to really navigate city approval processes. The other did the opposite, and it was more organic. I think both have their place in situations, dictate which approach you do. But as planners and other activists, how do we decide which approach to take?
That's a great question. I think this goes back to something I was saying earlier. I've always been intrigued and hesitant about tactical urbanism. Dylan writes about it in the intro, where it's available to those who have privileged identities and aren't scared of having interactions with police or lawmakers. For that reason, it feels limiting because it can only tell the stories of what's working for a very specific community of people. I think what Sherry does with Bloordale Beach and the story of these residents asking for forgiveness, not permission, but not even asking for forgiveness, I think is recognizing an urgent need to lift a community up at a time that was very scary in the world. No approvals were going to say yes, and that no harm was going to be caused. It's a great example of someone using a more privileged identity to tell a story that's like, we need to laugh. Because the Bloordale Beach story, setting up a few beach chairs and putting a sign on a construction lot covered in gravel, it made waves across the city. It became a tourist attraction. I'm actually pretty sure I have an entire book on it right here. I don't know how many images we have, but that's it right there. It's so good. But I think, to what I was saying earlier, what did we need? We needed to be inspired. We needed to be connected. We needed to have a good laugh. We needed to find levity in a really dark time. And it served that need. And this is again going to what are the clues here? And the clues are not that should be a park forever. I don't know if it needs to be. There'll be green space there. Are residents there taking the space because there's no other space? No, they were taking the space because it was a canvas to express, a counter narrative to what we were experiencing in that moment. Some of this can be ephemeral. Some of this is not always advocacy. And we need to create space for someone not to get in trouble because they tried to do that. This was less advocacy and more like an arm reaching out for connection. In the case of Plaza Pops, I think they did such an amazing job of naming a site of importance for communities across the city and saying, this is not good enough. These are places where we gather and can gather in a more intentional and supported way. And so Plaza Pops was very much the result of advocacy, which is we're not doing right by the communities that have this infrastructure and could really use an elevated sort of intervention that actually helps them gather, helps them eat together, helps them celebrate together, which is what they're already doing in these places. Some of it can be ephemeral, some of it can be permanent. And I think creating enough spaciousness, not having every space in the city be determined, it's a space for that ephemeral. To say, if there's a story that we need to share, we need to tell, we need to come together around, there is space for that. Streets are becoming spaces, right, for stories we need to tell all over the United States, right? We're taking spaces that are determined and using them to tell a story about a need we have to stop the flow of what's happening. I think in a lot of cases in our book, a lot of the interventions we see are actually not interrupting. They're taking spaces that are interstitial and bringing delight to them. And so I think we need all of that in our cities. We need spaces that are overdetermined so that when we need to call attention to something, we can interrupt flows and tell the story of our society. We also need spaces in real time where people can have conversations. And Bloordale Beach was a conversation. I think what Plaza Pops did was an intervention to serve needs in a community that were being underserved.
Well, the subtitle of the book is that we can't plan everything.
Yeah.
This is a podcast primarily for planners. So what role do you think planners can have in supporting the cultivation of creating these messy cities that allow everyone to thrive?
I think that the code and zoning bylaws and all these things are there to support us in creating places that people want to live, work, and play. Where they limit us is where we need to be okay, to be curious, to ask questions, to not let the sort of rigid guidelines we put in place determine how we live. I think it's also worth noting that, and this is, many of your listeners, maybe they may or may not agree, but the codes that contain the planning profession only represent a singular dimension, a single story of what a good life looks like. And I think that it is the responsibility of a planner to understand what a good life looks like for all the people that you are trying to serve. And that is where great community engagement and great research and great investment in the social infrastructure and understanding what's actually happening, what the heart of a place actually is your job. I'm not a planner by trade. I work with a lot of planners on planning projects. And a huge part of our efforts are always to say, but do these rules serve the people we're trying to serve? And I don't think it's to have anarchy and break the rules all the time, but I think it's to have sort of a level of inquiry and a level of openness to see where some of these structures that contain us are not serving us. And so I think it's the sort of principles of lead with inquiry. When you see something anomalous, like ask questions, say, tell me more, try and understand versus suppress, because there might be a way to integrate that learning into your planning and actually make this a place where people not just like they have great lives, but they feel seen and recognized in the process. And I think it's part of the outcome of any good community engagement. But I do think that part of what makes us feel emboldened in a city is when we feel seen and when we feel recognized and our needs are met. Our very specific needs can be met. Plaza Pops is a great example of that, where, the gathering in the parking lots are now just so dignified with these beautiful spaces to recognize the beauty of those gatherings. It sounds trite, but I think it requires a level of curiosity that I don't often see consistently deployed across the planning community. Staying open is hard. And, the rules-based order, as we've been discussing, is evolving and changing. And I think this is one of those places where if we can be responsive, I think we will continue to earn the right to this practice. Every discipline, every profession has to do that, is to continue their role within the social contract. And I think this is something planners really need to think about, which is like a huge part of our job is to create places that help people live a good life. Are we doing that? And so that would be my one of many asks, but I'll leave you with that.
As always, this is Booked on Planning. So what books would you recommend our readers check out?
Oh my gosh. What a great question. I know you told me this before. Give me 1 second and I will quickly tell you. I'm a voracious reader. So part of what I'm struggling with is there's too many books.
Seeing the background behind you, there's got to be hundreds of books behind you that you could recommend from.
Okay. One of my faves this year is A River Alive by Robert McFarlane. He's one of the most prolific nature writers and has really thought about how we think about the rights of nature. It's gone all over the world to sort of these different regions where people are fighting for the personhood of a body of water or a forest, the Amazon, a river in Quebec. And it's a really beautiful story, a beautiful way of bringing some of the earlier questions about nature to life. I love this book. It's called The Londoners by Craig Taylor. The subtitle is The Days and Nights of London Now, as told by those who love it, hate it, live it, left it, and long for it. And it is these short stories of everyone from, a taxi cab driver, one of the London cabbies, which is a very esteemed job, to someone new to the city doing odd jobs, to a banker. It's a great reminder of the messiness of most cities, which is there are so many lives being lived that we could never know. And so we cannot assume that everyone wants the same thing. So we have to do better at not having single stories. And then the last one, I would probably say, because I like things in threes, maybe I'll go with a classic, which is Robin Wall Kimmerer's The Serviceberry. None of these are planning books, but I think it's an essay that was published into a book. It's a tiny little book, but it talks a lot about what reciprocity means as we create anything. And I think to be planners and to offer so much and to be given so much. We do community engagement, we get all this community wisdom, but how are we constantly in this state of reciprocity versus this singular direction of how things are going to be? And I think it's a way of thinking about planning and how we build cities and communities that I think is quite beautiful, and it's really simple and it's really short read. So
I love it. 3 new books to add to our list. I don't think we've had those recommended yet. So.
Great. Oh, I'm so happy.
Yeah, we love when we get non-planning books.
Okay, great. I have so many more. So if you need more, I'm always here.
Well, Zahra, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast to talk about your book, Messy Cities, Why We Can't Plan Everything.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation with author Zahra Ebrahim on her book, Messy Cities, Why We Can't Plan Everything. You can get your own copy through the publisher at Coach House Books by supporting your local bookstore, or of course, supporting the show through our page at bookshop.org/shop/bookedonplanning. Remember to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and please rate, review, and share the show. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time on Booked on Planning.